Hi, folks. Ryan Honeyman here from Lift Economy. Many folks have come to us over the last 10 years and asked, how do I get more involved in creating an economy that works for the benefit of all life? They also ask, what skills and experiences do I need to help make this transition? So, 3 years ago, we created something called the Next Economy MBA to help address this and similar questions. Lift Economy's Next Economy MBA is an online course that's designed for entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, students, recent graduates, employees, and folks who want to learn more about transformational next economy strategies and businesses. Join the growing alumni network of nearly 250 alumni who've gone through this program and learned essential skills and hopefully built lifelong relationships for catalyzing businesses in the emergent and regenerative economy. So we encourage you to check out our course. You can go to lifteconomy.com/MBA. The next course, Cohort 7, starts on September 21st, 2021. So once again, go to www.lifteconomy.com/MBA. And now, on with the show. Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. John, welcome to the show.
It's great to be with you, Ryan.
So, John, I'll start with a bit of a tough question. So this is the cocktail party question. When someone comes up and says, John, what do you do? How do you answer that question?
It is a tough question. I usually respond by saying, are you sure you want the answer to that question? No, I say I'm working on the intersection between the whole sustainability challenge and economics and finance.
Fantastic. That is the best short elevator pitch. Describe how did you get involved in this? Maybe a brief background on, what you're doing at JP Morgan, and then this sort of the slow evolution to regenerative capitalism.
Sure. So I always like to say that I left Wall Street in 2001. I like to get that out on the record early, but yeah, I spent nearly 18 years at what I like to call the old JP Morgan. Most of that time managing capital markets and derivatives businesses, sort of during the early creation of derivatives and the time that derivatives transformed how finance worked and connected national capital markets together into one global capital market. So it was a fascinating and exciting time to be in the business. And then toward the end, I moved out of capital markets and into direct investing in what was called Morgan Capital. And I left a few months after the merger with Chase Manhattan Bank, mostly because the culture, the old Morgan culture that I and many of us stayed at the firm and worked in for a long period of time was clearly no longer going to be the culture of the new, much bigger firm, and I had been restless for some time anyway. So I really just used the merger as an excuse to step back and think more about what I really want to do with the rest of my career, and had really no plans or no idea, and I had no knowledge of the systemic crises that were unfolding in the environment at the time. And went into a period of doing, I guess, what you would call dabbling in impact investing. Although I'd actually gotten involved in that in Morgan Capital, my first investment was in the Edison Schools Project, which was a charter school management company. So I was already thinking about this idea of aligning capital and social purpose before I left Morgan. And so I continued doing that. I joined the board of Investor Circle and got involved with that group, but all along started reading a lot of books and learned about the environmental crises and how it's one big systemic challenge as opposed to a series of one-off issues. And it's sort of like what I've sometimes referred to as a rolling epiphany. I came to realize that the economic system was the root cause of these issues, and despite all of its positive attributes. And as a finance guy, you quickly realize that if it's the economy and finance is what's driving the economy, then the leverage point to work on really is the financial system. So that's how I got to the launch of Capital Institute. It took the financial crisis for me to gather the courage, I suppose, to actually launch it. But I'd been thinking about it for a while. So in 2002, I launched Capital Institute, and we've been sort of finding our way in the fog ever since.
And during that rolling epiphany, were there particular organizations or thought leaders that influenced and sort of pushed you forward on that path?
Yeah, absolutely. In no particular order, but the ones that leaped to the top of my mind, I read Schumacher for the first time, and was very moved and inspired by that thinking. Both his Small is Beautiful, but also his last book called A Guide for the Perplexed. And then I would put Herman Daly at the top of the list. And he was one of the co-founders of this whole ecological economics school of thinking. And his simple idea of imposing scale as a constraint on a macroeconomy was and is very profound. I read the famous Limits to Growth book that the Club of Rome put out, and that very much shook me to the core. I guess the other name I put at the top of the list, actually, I learned about through one of my impact investment projects with a man named Alan Savory. And Savory has developed what he calls holistic planned grazing for managing the world's grasslands. And so this idea of holism, it was actually coined by a man named Jan Smuts, a South African. And through Alan, I learned about Smuts's work in a book called Holism and Evolution. And that is absolutely at the center of my current thinking. So, I could go on. There's many more thinkers and practitioners that I've been learning from, but I would say those are the foundational ones that have been most impactful for me personally.
Fantastic. And I'll definitely get into Savory and your work at Grasslands, but maybe first, in the larger umbrella of the Capital Institute, what are some of the main initiatives that you guys are focusing on?
Well, we've sort of been pursuing the exploration of an economy that works, to just put it simply, and that's led us to this idea of regeneration. And what we mean by that is a system that operates the way all other systems in the universe that have stood that last work. So we know a lot now about system science, and whether it's your body or my body or a natural ecosystem or a human economy, our hypothesis is that there are common patterns and principles that describe how they work if they're to work in a healthy, sustainable way. And so what we're really doing is not inventing a new theory, but we're trying to discern the common patterns of how systems work and then apply them to a human economy. And so that is the core work stream of Capital Institute, and it was culminated really last year with the launch of a white paper at Yale called Regenerative Capitalism, How Universal Principles and Patterns Will Shape the New Economy. And yet theory alone is insufficient, and so our other core activity stream is a storytelling initiative which we call our field guide, and we've studied now some 35 projects where we see these principles in the real world. And so our belief is that this regenerative economy is, to use the systems language, it's an emergent phenomenon, meaning it's happening organically by itself, and that we often don't see it. It's often hidden in plain sight because we look at things through our conventional economic lens, and so these projects or companies don't we don't see the common pattern the way we would once we understand what the regenerative framework is really all about. So it's this theory and practice together, and each learning from each other. And so it's sort of I'm waving my hands, which doesn't work too well on radio, but it's sort of this symbiotic learning process between studying entrepreneurs that are making this happen in the real world almost instinctively, and then trying to discern and integrate a theory that supports it. And then the final thing I would say is that the theory is still very high level, and so we have a science-driven initiative underway to essentially build out the foundation and make it much more rigorous underneath this framework. And part of that is developing measures of regenerative health so that we can measure and then manage economies in a way that's aligned with the regenerative ideas.
So you're a business guy, so I'm going to ask you for the 80-20 on this one. So if you had to drop the vast majority of the things that you look at and only really focus on 2 to 3 solutions or 2 to 3 ideas or 2 to 3 initiatives, are there a small amount that really stand out to you as like, hey, this has got some serious oomph behind it?
Do you mean business initiatives?
Yeah, so maybe just business initiatives would be great. Yeah, maybe out of the 35 field guide folks,
Yeah.
or yeah.
Well, I guess the first thing I'd say is there's a so I'm very passionate about trying to find a pathway to an economy that works for people and doesn't destroy the planet. That's the goal. And of course the news on climate change just gets more and more frightening. So I've been very, very focused on trying to find new solutions and hopeful areas to engage in around that specific issue. And that's how I got involved with the Grasslands and the idea that there are natural carbon sinks, the biggest one being the ocean, and then the second largest and third largest being the grasslands, or more accurately, the soil under the grasslands, and the forests. And so I guess in terms of big ideas that I'm very passionate on that are still not yet fully in the public awareness, the idea of regenerating the natural carbon sinks that have been in many cases turned into carbon sources is a very hopeful area to work on. But I wouldn't want to present it as a silver bullet. I don't think there are any silver bullets, and the rollout of solar panels on rooftops is absolutely critical and essential. It's just not something that I'm personally that involved in or that passionate in, but it doesn't mean it's not critical.
Yeah, I think that's important nuance, because I too am. I think we spoke a little bit about this a few weeks ago, but Lift Economy's pretty excited about climate change has been sort of a challenge that's very large and hard to define, whereas now there's sort of a rallying cry around carbon, and
Yeah.
it seems more tangible now that something can be done. So you've been involved with Grasslands for at least a few years. So what's some of the data and news coming out of that area of your work?
Okay. Well, Just to quickly explain it, so the simple idea that Alan and others have worked on for some 30, 40 years now is that um, there's a symbiotic relationship between large herbivores and the world's grasslands. And think back to the days of the buffalo in the northern Great Plains in the United States. They were large animals that eat grass, and they moved around in herds to protect themselves from predators. And we've sort of systematically killed off the buffalo and replaced them on the land with domesticated cattle. But we've done it in a way where the cattle aren't required to herd to protect themselves from predators because we've killed the predators, and we've put up fences so they kind of wander around and eat whatever grass they want to eat, and they're not, in a sense, there's nothing moving them in a systematic way across the land the way the buffalo naturally and instinctively moved. And by bunching the animals in dense herds, and then managing them in this, it's a complicated process, which Alan calls holistic planned grazing, but it's understanding the context that you're in, the amount of rainfall that's happening, the condition on the land, and a whole bunch of other factors. You set up a grazing plan that determines how long the animals stay in different parts of the land, and when you move them on to the next part of the land. And that has the effect of causing the grass to be healthier and grow more, which has the effect of making it more resilient, which has the effect, and at the same time, a coincidental benefit is that by growing more grass, you're building more root systems, which sequesters more carbon. Now, we haven't got the science on the carbon measurement down pat yet. There's a lot of work happening on that now, which is very exciting, and some of the signals are very hopeful, and some of the signals are less clear as to how hopeful they may be. But common sense tells me that if you have more grass and healthier grass, you have more roots and deeper roots, and therefore you're sequestering more carbon than if that weren't the case. And what's also clear, common sense, is that the grasslands are vast. They're roughly a third of the land-based planet. So if one can shift the management of the grasslands to mimic what was more naturally existing before man came and essentially took over the grasslands, we're going to make a meaningful dent in the net carbon load in the atmosphere by sequestering it, more of it into the soil. And there's hot debates about how much potential there is, and what about the methane of cows and all this stuff. So it's not, there's no clear, hard scientific facts yet. But what's also clear is that much of the climate science that generates all of the dire warnings does not yet include the potential from natural carbon sequestration, particularly in the grasslands. So the whole field of agriculture and grazing and its current contribution to climate change based on current practice, and its potential contribution to be a meaningful solution to the challenge is an area that's very hopeful. And what Grasslands is a company, a for-profit company that manages large-scale landscapes, large-scale ranches using this method. And it's a partnership with the Savory Institute that's been in business for about 6 years now, and we manage, round numbers, 200,000 acres around the world. Montana, South Dakota, Florida, New Zealand are our current areas of operation. And we have good data on the improvement on the land. We do ecological monitoring on an annual basis, and we can demonstrate that the land is healthier than it was, and that it has less, it essentially has more grass plants and more diversity of plants. We have baseline carbon data, but no no subsequent carbon data, so we can't say anything yet about whether we're sequestering carbon. That's pretty much the story. The land management business is really a way to deploy some capital in alignment with our thinking, but on a bigger scale, it's meant to prove up this land management practice using real money and real long-term, where we have control of land over the long term. But the big play is through the nonprofit, which is called Savory Institute, which is essentially a training. It's a hub and spoke training system where there's now I think it's 25 hubs around the world that are training centers for this holistic grazing system. And so the business and the training, the nonprofit training, which is run on a decentralized basis by people that know the context and the cultures that they're operating in. The idea is that the two of these working together will move the transition to holistic management forward on a large scale in the world, on a fast pace. And it's going well. I encourage people that are interested, go to savoryinstitute.org. And Grasslands website is grasslands-llc.com.
Do you do a compost application?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there is some work being done out there on the West Coast using compost. We operate on landscapes that are at a scale where it's hard for me to conceive of how you would do supplemental compost. The ranches we manage are measured in thousands and tens of thousands of acres. They're in much more brittle landscapes than the work using compost out in California are doing. So no, we don't use compost, although there's some very hopeful work being done where you essentially stimulate the grass carbon sequestering potential by adding compost, and I guess it's like a jump start, as I understand it, to the photosynthetic process and the carbon sequestration process. But it's an idea that works well in one context. It would work well in Vermont, I imagine, but out in the dry, arid, eastern Montana plains where we're involved, it'd be hard to imagine how you do that. So the compost essentially comes from the animals themselves, and most of our operations, or I should say, all of the operations in the United States are cattle operations. But in New Zealand, the ranch there runs cattle, sheep, and even deer. This principle works regardless of what type of ruminant you're using. The key to the healthy grass is the symbiotic relationship between an animal that eats grass and processes grass and has enough weight and hoof action to turn over the soil as it moves through, which creates more surface area on the land than if it's allowed to get compacted. And then, and this is particularly important in the dry landscapes where most of the grasslands are, when it does rain, you then retain the moisture in the water as opposed to the water running off the land. And so the hoof impact is actually a very important piece of the process.
Yeah, it's just it's very exciting, and it's interesting and affirming to hear you mention that the carbon sequestration is, at least if you had to drop a lot of the things, it would still be one of the things you'd be passionate about and focus on. So
yeah, absolutely. Paul Hawken is leading an initiative called Project Drawdown, and they're essentially trying to assess, what sort of the top 100 activities we need to aggressively pursue that can collectively get to drawing down carbon. And I'm not sure where agricultural-based carbon sequestration is going to fall in the end, but I know it's one of the important opportunities that they've identified in their research. So I think it certainly will be with us. The challenge is that the most productive land where you can sequester carbon in the soil is generally where it rains more. So think of the state of Illinois and the state of Kansas and further east than the drier plains closer to the Rocky Mountains. And that's the land that we've converted into cropland and much of it, soil or rather corn and soybean. And because it's more productive, it's much more valuable economically as corn and soybean than it would be as pasture. But that's where, in the old days, before we destroyed it, that's where the tallgrass prairies were. And the tallgrass prairies have longer roots, and therefore they sequester a lot more carbon. And again, more rain, more photosynthesis, naturally you would think more carbon. So the practical challenge is that probably in the areas on the landscape where we should do this the fastest, the economic impediment of converting farmland back to pasture land is quite high. Whereas where we operate is essentially where it's too dry to grow crops anyway. So the land is much, much less expensive and therefore makes it economically viable to use as cattle grazing ground. So plenty of challenges ahead.
Well, it's phenomenal if you could demonstrate carbon sequestration without compost, because it is pretty. In California, I think we have a lot of compost, but it would take almost all of the current stores to spread it all around, and so
Yeah.
I don't think we would have enough to sort of helicopter in a bunch of compost to Montana, but. It's amazing if you guys were onto something without that application.
Yeah, there's controversy around whether it's possible without the supplemental compost. Certainly, the savory people, while they don't question that the composting, there's now good scientific evidence that accelerates and catalyzes the process. The flip side of it is there's 12 feet of dark soil underneath Iowa that would suggest that over thousands of years, the system worked just fine without supplemental compost. It'd be hard for me to believe that's the only way to make the system work, because the 12 feet of soil is evidence that the system works without the compost.
Yep, very good point. In one of your talks, I think someone asked you, "Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future?" So, what's your knowing? And you almost know too much, but knowing what you know, how would you answer that question?
Well, I am hopeful, and I choose to remain hopeful. I think if you study the climate science and take it at its face value, one can't help but become, seriously concerned, let's say. But my study of system science and my colleague Sally Gorner, who is really a tremendous addition to our team and our thinking and reason why I remain hopeful, is that she'll explain that the way systems adapt in the real world is when the pressure rises, they're forced to adapt. And so, and a simple example is that a pot of water only boils when you turn up the heat under it. And so, even though sitting here today and knowing what we now know, and you sort of extrapolate all these trends, you can get yourself pretty upset and depressed. That doesn't take account of the changing context and the rising pressure that will cause changes to happen that would be impossible to anticipate. And if you think about the big changes that have happened in the past, that's exactly the way it works. So, for example, who would have anticipated the Berlin Wall was going to fall down or come down, a month before it happened? And who would have who would have anticipated that we would break free of the slavery institution, 10 years before that happened. So things happen slowly and then very quickly, and so I remain optimistic and bound and determined to work on, essentially turning the heat up on the system and helping us figure out the pathway so we can, we can't manage this complexity, but we can influence how it unfolds, and I think that's our challenge, is to be smart about it and help guide the shifts that are already underway. And for what it's worth, I view the current U.S. political election, idiocy as just further evidence of the pressure building. And so, part of me remains very hopeful that we've gotten ourselves in such a bind now that things are starting to shift, which doesn't mean it's going to be all smooth and easy and fun.
Right. Yeah. It's, one thing I've thought about in the last few years is just the role of technology, both in terms of its potential to harm, but also the transparency potential, with obviously Panama Papers and,
Yeah.
The Arab Spring, and just the ability to know more immediately.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's promising in a way that just simply sort of rising awareness of the current state without even necessarily forcing change immediately, just the raising awareness, I think, will actually create change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll use that as a hook to reconnect with the regenerative framework. So one of the 8 principles that we've identified in regenerative economics is what we call robust circulation. But just again, think of your body. Obviously, your circulatory system for oxygen, blood is fundamental to your health, and that's true of any living system. And if you think about it, a human economy, one of the things that the internet has enabled is the massive acceleration of circulation of information. So it's circulation of energy, materials, but also information. And in the future, I think we will add empathy to that. The take up of Instagram and how my kids share pictures around is as a very seasoned computer science guy that I've met pointed out to me, that's early stages of circulating empathy, which is also important to do. And so if we understood the emergence of the internet and of social media as a phase leap, massive increase in critical circulation, then we would become much more hopeful that the system is emerging in a way that actually is aligned with how regenerative systems work in the rest of the known living world. So it's happening. It's just that we don't have the lens or the theory to see it in a way that would give us the confidence that the regenerative economy or regenerative thinking is actually already happening, even without someone needing to define it.
Yeah. One other approach I've thought about is just consciousness. So, I'm a Buddhist, so I meditate a bunch and try to go on retreats. And it seemed to me, one of the sort of critiques I think the Buddha made was, there has to be right effort and right action, in the sense that we could get a ton of people to join, say, a nonprofit, and then they're technically working in a good field, but if the level of consciousness is like completely cussing out the other side and just hating and sort of like anger, it seems like that is not, like, it's an action, but it's perhaps not right action. And so what do you think the role of stepping back and consciousness is in relation to creating the regenerative economy?
Well, that's a great question. Um, so I'll share a lesson that a very wise woman named Monica Sharma taught me, and she's a big systems thinker. She spent a lot of time at the UN. When I was introduced to her, she was described to me as the woman who more than anyone is responsible for solving the AIDS crisis in Africa. Um, and she has a very simple diagram of three circles that she uses. And so visualize the outer circle represents the problems in the world that people are working on and trying to solve. The inner circle represents consciousness or spirit, and the middle circle represents the system design. And so, she said there's sort of three types of people in the world, and this is obviously way too broad a generalization, but she was making a point. And she said, most people work on the outer circle, which is problem solving. And of course, it's critical that we have people working on problems. And you could probably describe any business person is working on a problem on any given day, the business itself, as well as the issues that come up within the business. Nonprofit leaders are working on problems. Government people are working on problems. We're a culture that works on problems as a thing we do, which is great. And then there's a group of people that operate primarily on that inner circle, which is, think of the sort of to stereotype it, it's a monk who's praying 24/7 and working to shift human consciousness as a pathway to addressing the challenges in the world. And then there's this third layer, which is the system layer, and there aren't that many people working on the system design because most of us take the system as a given or something beyond our control. And Monica's point was that in order to actually create great change and shift systems, you can't just work on the system level. You actually need to work on the consciousness shift at the level of yourself first. And you also need to keep your hands dirty in the real world, working on real problems, and keep it real and grounded, and keep it attached to the particular context of real world problems. But then you also need to work on the system design and the system shifting work. And so she draw an arrow between or across all three layers and say that the real challenge is to work on all three spheres at the same time and hold them all together, which is hard. But anyway, that's how I sort of think about the consciousness piece as being a part of a three-layered or three-level approach to system change. And I certainly the shift that I've gone through and am continuing to go through since I left Wall Street, would have to be described as a shift in consciousness. So I feel very passionate about that piece of it.
That's a fantastic. What was her name again?
Monica Sharma.
Sharma.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to look her up. That's a really amazing illustration because I agree. I no longer believe that everyone should just go meditate first before solving the problems because and I'm just realizing there's like different places for different people. There's a place for activism and chaining yourself to a bulldozer, and then there's a place for people who are working on changing larger companies who are already really bad to being slightly better. And then there's also a place for sort of growing these ultra sustainable biomimetic companies. So I used to believe that there was like one best place, but I think it's that all need to be happening at once.
Yeah, and I totally share that. I spent years after I left Wall Street trying to figure out, what's the one thing I should do, and what's the highest, impact, and I think we're just naturally inclined to be searching for silver bullets or optimal things, and I don't know, I still do, but but I then have to remind myself that that's probably a false search. But I also agree with what you said. I think what's also equally important is we each need to find what's sort of our own unique essence and where we individually concentrate. There's no right answer to that other than knowing yourself and figuring out how you can make a unique contribution to something that's just so much bigger than any of us individually. That I always say there's not going to be any people of the year or heroes in this. This is a much more of a collective effort than an individual hero effort.
And so moving forward, looking forward a little bit for Capital Institute over the next 5 or 10 years, are you heading directionally towards a stronger emphasis in any of the particular initiatives that you're currently working on? Like, what's sort of the direction that the Capital Institute is heading?
Yeah. So, we talk about it internally as if with the launch of the paper, we've reached base camp. And so we're in the process of resourcing ourselves, re-strategizing and figuring out, what's the next, where the next climb should take us. And I'd say it's, we've sort of gone through our birthing experience and now we're adolescents and we need to mature as an organization and become, we're still a very small nonprofit, and you could describe the work we're involved in is helping to develop a new school of economics, which alone is a massive undertaking, and so we basically need to institutionalize ourselves. We'll soon be out trying to recruit a new executive director. We need to raise more money and build out the theory and the rigorous underpinnings of the theory, but then at the same time, kind of sticking with the Monica Sharma, thinking. We need to build out an ability to implement these ideas in the real world. And we've got incoming demand for that already, and so we're talking about creating what would look like a consulting capability to actually help, whether it's individual businesses or ideally regional economies, implement some of this thinking. That would be an area that we'd ideally like to explore. And then we're very passionate about the need to, at the same time, communicate this through storytelling. And so we're working on a project this year called Regenerate New York City, which will be at least a year long. It'll probably be many year long storytelling initiative where, I use the language, the regenerative economy exists in New York City. It's just hidden in plain sight because obviously the New York City economy is massive and booming in many other places, but there's all kinds of interesting things happening below the surface that we're going to try to illuminate and describe through this regenerative lens. And then, and finally, since you asked if I had my druthers, we would have an endowment so that the Capital Institute was itself sustainable, and then we would use the regenerative principles to deploy the endowment and invest in the emergence of the regenerative system itself, while at the same time providing some financial support for the work, the intellectual work that we're doing. So that's kind of our 5 to 10 year vision in a nutshell.
And yeah, I guess my follow on be, what do you need? And I think you mentioned a few things. So are there other things that our listeners could help you do in order to grow this next economy?
Well, that's a wonderful question to have to answer. So we certainly need to raise, serious financial resources. We're working on that now and are having some success. We need both operating support as well as but ideally we would have an endowment or a PRI fund to leverage off of for this work. And we're very keen to attract the people that in a sense, are meant to work on this together, and that's happening. It's a very interesting. It's not like we have a list of job descriptions and we're out looking to recruit people, and we don't have the money to do that, even if we wanted to. But this is, I describe it as that, we're sort of self-organizing ourselves around this work, and people keep getting attracted to us, who have been working on similar ideas on their own, and so I think the challenge is for us to figure out how to catalyze this into some critical mass, and then and attract the people that know how to manage that and know how to build that out, and sort of grow it organically in that sense, but with urgency, because these, time is short on many of these issues, as you know very well.
Yeah, we should definitely. Your idea of consulting for local economies, we should definitely talk more about that at some point. I'd love to, hear what you
Yeah.
guys have in store.
Yeah, and likewise, we need to learn more about what you have in store as well, what you're not only in store, but what you're putting into practice, because that's a conversation we should have.
So, last few things here. You mentioned some of the people who inspired you on your sort of earlier path. So, who do you look to now? What thought leaders or authors or organizations do you say, aha, like this person or company is really living the regenerative economy life that we need?
That's a good question. So I guess the first thing I would say is that I'm not naive to think that this is easy, or that the regenerative economy is, is fully out there and working. And so it would be hard to name a company that anyone would have heard of and point to it and say that's a regenerative economy. I think many companies are wrestling and struggling to understand how this might work and how it might be possible for them to transition into that. But it's very much an aspiration at this stage, and a roadmap, more than it is a living thing. Although it is living in small scale examples, the ones that we describe in our field guide. But I don't know. I guess there's no kind of individual person or project that sort of leaps to mind as the one, that we're looking toward. I think it's more. I think my focus is more on getting a deeper understanding of the science part of this, and then trying to figure out how this. I mean, ultimately, excuse me. Ultimately, I believe that a huge leverage point here is shifting how finance works, and that's where I can bring my own expertise to bear. And I think I guess maybe I would answer your question this way. I would say I think probably the most important leverage point that we've not even begun to scratch the surface on is reconnecting and relationship. In right relationship is one of the principles. And if I think about finance kind of at the macro scale, the flow of investment capital is absolutely critical. And yet the way investment capital flows today has been separated. The principal asset owners, the pension system, sovereign wealth funds, has essentially been disaggregated or separated from the big enterprises that largely define the global economy, through the very efficient capital markets. So we now have big companies making capital allocation decisions absent the influence and responsibility of their owners, because their owners are just shareholders that are temporary. And until we reconnect these real owners with real enterprises, with a new understanding of what investment means, then we're all working on the problem solving and not the system shifting piece. And so, at any rate, our focus over the next 5 years is going to very much include starting new conversations with institutional scale investment capital in a way that serves their needs and interests as well as the broader needs and interests of the global economy. And I think that's a big area of opportunity.
Fantastic, John. So where can people learn more about you and your work at Capital Institute?
Well, we're at capitalinstitute.org, and there's pretty much everything. That's the doorway into everything. There's a separate website for the field guide, but you can find a link to it at Capital Institute. And you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook and all that good stuff as well.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.